The register at the Mapleroft Inn showed 14 guests checked in during October. 13 names appeared in the ink. The 14th entry, Room 7, the corner room, had been written over, not crossed out. Written over in a different hand with different ink on the same line. The original name was still faintly legible beneath it. Someone had not erased a mistake. Someone had replaced a person. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where the English countryside keeps its darkest secrets behind lace curtains and civil smiles. Tonight we go to Breenham, where an inn with a rather unfortunate history has received one guest too many. This is the inn that collected corpses. The Chapter 1. The inn at the end of the lane. The village of Breenham was not the sort of place that appeared on any map of particular consequence. It sat in a shallow fold of the Surrey Hills, connected to the larger world by a single-track road that became unreliable in autumn and nearly impassable by January. And the villagers had long since accepted this fact with the particular species of contentment that comes not from satisfaction, but from the absence of expectation. They had their post office, which also sold tinned goods and dubious newspapers. They had their church, whose vicar was gentle and prone to long silences. They had their public house, the Wheat Sheaf, which smelled of old wood and older opinions. And they had the Mapleroft Inn, which stood at the far end of the lane that curved behind the village green, half hidden by a row of horse chestnuts that shed their conkers each year onto the flagstone path with the reliability of a pension payment. The inn was old in the comfortable sense, its beams genuinely black with age, its floors genuinely uneven, its fireplaces genuinely functional. Mrs. Edith Rudd had run it for 11 years, since her husband Gerald had died of a heart complaint that the doctor attributed to rich food, and Gerald's friends attributed to Edith's temperament. She was a capable woman, spare and watchful, with the kind of face that absorbed information without volunteering any in return. She kept a clean house, charged fair rates, and did not inquire too closely into the business of her guests, which is perhaps why the Mapleroft had over the years attracted a clientele of slightly unusual character. It was into this establishment that Miss Jane Marple arrived on the 14th of October, carried in a hired motor car arranged by her nephew Raymond, who had insisted she take a rest from St. Mary Mead following a bout of bronchitis that he described as alarming and she described as tiresome. She had not wanted to come to Breenham particularly. She had, in fact, wanted to go to Torquay, where the sea air was reliable. But Raymond had a friend who knew the Maplecroft, and Raymond's friend had said it was restful. And so here she was, being deposited at the flagstone path, while the horse chestnuts shed their conkers obligingly around her luggage. Mrs. Rudd received her with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to guests who arrived expecting things she had not promised. Miss Marple was given room 4, a pleasant room at the front, overlooking the lane, and beyond it, a scrap of the village green. It smelled of lavender and old plaster, which she found quite agreeable. She unpacked her own case, a habit she had never surrendered to the assistance of others, and arranged her knitting by the window before going downstairs to take tea. The sitting room of the Maplecroft was the sort of room that invited lingering. 2 sofas faced the fireplace, their upholstery faded to a pleasant non-committal beige. A writing desk stood against the far wall, supplied with the sort of stationery that suggested correspondence, but discouraged actual correspondence by being slightly damp. A bookcase held 24 volumes, among them a 1948 hotel guide to the West Country, A novel whose jacket had been removed so that its title remained a mystery, and a dictionary with the letter Q missing from its spine. 3 other guests were at tea when Miss Marple came down. The first was a man of perhaps 55, who sat with the contained stillness of someone accustomed to waiting for things. He had a long, careful face and hands that rested too deliberately on his knees, as if they had been placed there rather than simply arrived. He gave his name later as Mr. Clifford Hadley, and said he was in Breenham on business connected with property, though he did not specify whose property or what the business was, and nobody asked. The second was a younger woman, perhaps 30, who sat nearest the fire and appeared to be reading but was not. She held her book at the correct angle, and her eyes moved occasionally, but the quality of her attention was directed elsewhere, toward the window perhaps, or toward the door, or toward something that had not yet entered the room. She was introduced by Mrs. Rudd as Miss Constance Avery, and she looked up when her name was spoken with an expression that suggested she had heard it before, and found it mildly surprising on each occasion. The third guest was a man who introduced himself before anyone asked, as Major Arnold Tukes, retired, and proceeded to explain the retirement with a thoroughness that suggested the retirement still troubled him. He had been in India, he said, and before India, in Malaya, and he had views on the current government, the current state of the roads, and the current quality of English mustard, all of which he expressed with the confident inaccuracy of a man who has not recently been contradicted. Miss Marple poured her tea. Mrs. Rudd had left the pot, and departed with the efficiency of a woman who understood the value of her own absence, and observed her fellow guests with the quiet, unhurried attention that those who knew her would have recognized immediately, and those who did not would have mistaken for mild vacancy. There was something slightly off in the room. She could not have said precisely what it was, not yet, not with only 6 minutes of observation behind her. But there was the sense, familiar, not unwelcome, that the 3 people taking tea with her were not quite as they appeared, and that the Mapleroft Inn, for all its comfortable creaking, contained something that had not yet made itself visible. Mrs. Rudd reappeared briefly to mention that dinner was at 7, that the bathroom on the first floor was occupied between 6 and 6:45 by Major Tukes, who kept very regular habits, and that room 7 was being prepared for a new arrival expected this evening. "Room 7, said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Is that the corner room?" "It is," said Mrs. Rudd. "I noticed the register as I came in," said Miss Marple, with the gentle vagueness of someone mentioning a cloud formation. "It seemed rather a popular room." Something passed across Mrs. Rudd's face. Not alarm, not quite, but the antecedent of alarm, the moment before a door closes. "It's a good-sized room," she said. "Guests seem to prefer it." Then she left, and the sitting-room returned to its quiet, and the fire made its small sounds, and outside the horse-chestnuts dropped another conker onto the flagstone path, and Miss Marple drank her tea and said nothing further, which was not the same as thinking nothing further at all. The new arrival came at 6:30. Miss Marple heard the motor car from her window. She had gone upstairs to dress for dinner, and observed a man of indeterminate middle age climbing out with a single overnight bag. He looked up at the inn before entering it, which was not in itself remarkable. What was perhaps slightly remarkable was that he did not look up with the expression of a man arriving somewhere for the first time. He looked up with the expression of a man arriving somewhere he had been meaning to return to for a very long while. His name, she learned at dinner, was Mr. Peter Soane. He was given room 7. By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was in bed with her knitting and the decapitated novel from the sitting-room bookcase, which turned out to be a middling thriller about a poisoning in Devonshire. She read 12 pages before setting it down. Outside, the lane was quite dark. The horse-chestnuts had stopped their dropping. The Mapleroft Inn settled around its guests with the solidity of old timber and old stone, and the register sat open on the hall desk, and on the 14th line, beneath the careful second-hand entry for room 7, the ghost of the first name lay half visible in the dried ink, patient as a question that has not yet been asked aloud. Chapter 2. What the register remembered. The morning arrived in Breenham, the way mornings often did in October, reluctantly, and with a certain grey determination, and as though the light had been talked into appearing, but reserved the right to withdraw at any moment. A thin mist sat over the village green, softening the outlines of the oak tree at its centre and the bench beneath it, where nobody sat at this hour, and the post office beyond, whose lights were not yet on. Miss Marple was, as was her custom, the first guest downstairs. She had slept reasonably well, which she attributed less to the mattress, serviceable though the left side dipped, and more to the particular quality of country silence that St. Mary Mead had taught her to value. She had lain awake perhaps 20 minutes before sleeping, turning over the matter of the register with the methodical patience she applied to any arrangement that did not quite fit. The way one turns a jigsaw piece in the hand before placing it, not forcing but considering. The hall was empty when she descended. The register lay on the desk precisely where it had been the previous evening, and Miss Marple paused beside it with the unhurried air of someone waiting for the breakfast gong, her eyes moving across the open page. There were 14 entries in October, as she had noted. The handwriting varied across them. Some guests had signed themselves. Others had been entered by Mrs. Rudd in her compact, backwards-leaning script. The entry for room 7 was on the 14th line. The overwriting was visible in the morning light, brown ink beneath, blue ink above, and the 2 layers not quite aligned, so that certain letters of the original name protruded at the edges of the replacement name, like roots showing beneath a lawn, but the original name appeared to have begun with the letter V. The replacement name, entered in blue ink in Mrs. Rudd's hand, read P. Soane. This was curious. Not alarming, not yet, but curious in the way that a small error in an account book is curious. It may be nothing, or it may be the surface expression of something that runs considerably deeper. Miss Marple had, over the years, developed a thorough respect for the small error. She moved away from the desk when she heard Mrs. Rudd's footsteps on the kitchen flags. Breakfast was taken in a narrow dining room at the back of the inn, where 4 small tables were set with white cloths and the kind of crockery that had been purchased for its practicality, and had gone on to become inadvertently charming through long use. Miss Marple chose the table by the window, which looked onto a kitchen garden that was still producing the last of its runner beans, and a considerable quantity of cheerful resentment from the cat who patrolled it. The guests arrived in sequence. Major Tukes came first, at 8:10, and ate with military application, reading a newspaper that appeared to be 2 days old without this causing him any visible concern. He said good morning to Miss Marple, with the comfortable brevity of a man who has fulfilled his social obligations for the morning and considers the account closed. Miss Avery came next at 20 past. She had dressed carefully, more carefully than breakfast in a small inn strictly required, and her eyes moved to the door each time it opened, which it did 3 times during her meal, each time admitting nobody of apparent significance, and she ate very little and drank 2 cups of strong tea. Mr. Hadley appeared at 8:30, nodded to the room in general, and positioned himself at the table furthest from the window, which gave him a view of both the door and the remaining guests simultaneously. Miss Marple noted that he had the habit of arranging things, his cup, his cutlery, his folded newspaper, into precise parallel lines before attending to them. Mr. Soane did not come down to breakfast. Mrs. Rudd, delivering toast to Miss Marple's table, mentioned this without being asked, in the tone of someone forestalling a question. "Mr. Soane takes breakfast in his room," she said. "He asked when he arrived. Some guests prefer it." "Quite understandable," said Miss Marple warmly, "after a long journey particularly." Mrs. Rudd's expression performed a small calculation. "He didn't come far," she said. "He came from London." "London to Surrey is not so very long," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "And yet one always arrives a little tired, I find. Do you know London well, Mr. Hadley?" The question was addressed to the next table with the conversational ease of a woman accustomed to village breakfasts, where boundaries between tables are largely theoretical. Mr. Hadley looked up from his newspaper with an expression that suggested he had not expected to be included. "Reasonably well," he said. "I have business there." "Property," said Miss Marple, recalling his mention of the previous evening, "among other things." He returned to his newspaper with a finality that was not quite rude, but was quite deliberate. Miss Avery set down her teacup. It made a small, precise sound against the saucer. "Are you here on holiday, Miss Marple?" she asked. There was something careful in the question. Not hostility, but the quality of attention one applies when determining whether a thing is what it appears to be. "Recuperation," said Miss Marple. "My nephew worries, which is kind of him. He worries rather more than the situation warrants, but I have found that one ought not to discourage people from caring, even when their caring takes inconvenient forms." Miss Avery smiled, briefly, genuinely, and then seemed to recollect something, and the smile withdrew. After breakfast, Miss Marple took her knitting to a chair near the sitting-room window and applied herself to what appeared to be a great concentration on the knitting, and was, in fact, a thorough observation of the comings and goings of the hall. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Rudd went up the stairs carrying a breakfast tray. At 10:17, she came back down without it. At 10:43, the door to the upstairs corridor opened and closed, but no footsteps descended the stairs. At 11, Miss Avery put on her coat and left the inn, walking in the direction of the village with the slightly overdetermined stride of someone who has decided to look purposeful. Mr. Hadley made a telephone call from the hall at 11:15. Miss Marple, whose hearing was considerably better than her occasional expression of vague confusion implied, caught 3 things. A name she did not recognize, Ferrers, the word confirmed. And after a pause, the word already, spoken in a tone that belonged not to information being given, but to information being received with something adjacent to relief. He replaced the receiver with some deliberateness, and stood for a moment beside the desk. And Miss Marple, without raising her eyes from her knitting, was reasonably certain that his gaze had settled on the register. At 11:30, she went for a short walk along the lane. The horse-chestnuts were magnificent in their October decline, and the conkers on the path had been crushed by the morning's one early motor car into a bright green and white debris that smelled of something astringent and faintly medicinal. The lane curved behind the inn and joined a footpath that ran along the edge of a field where 3 horses stood in collective philosophical silence. Miss Marple walked slowly, as her doctor had recommended, and thought about the name that began with V. She thought about it in relation to Mr. Sohn, who had looked at the inn with the expression of return. She thought about it in relation to Mrs. Rudd, whose composure was genuine, but whose composure was being maintained. There is a difference between a still surface and a deep one, and she had long ago learned to recognize the effort required for the former. And she thought about it in relation to Miss Avery, who watched the door, and Mr. Hadley, who had said the word already, as though a thing had occurred sooner than expected. When she returned to the inn at noon, she noticed that the breakfast tray outside room 7 had been left in the upstairs corridor. The tea in the cup, visible as she passed on her way to her own room, was completely cold, and had been for some time. The toast on the plate had not been touched at all. Chapter 3. The difficulty with room 7. Mrs. Rudd discovered it at 12:30. Miss Marple heard the sound from her room, not a scream, which would have been understandable, and not silence, which would have been worse, but something between the two. A single sharp intake of breath, followed by a stillness that was itself a kind of sound, the way a suddenly stopped clock is louder than a ticking one. Then the footsteps, rapid and controlled, descending the stairs, and the brief murmur of Mrs. Rudd's voice from the hall below, speaking into the telephone with the flat precision of someone reciting information they have prepared themselves to recite. Miss Marple set down her knitting. She waited 3 minutes, which was enough time for Mrs. Rudd to finish the call, and not enough time for her to have gathered the composure required to manage 4 guests, and then went out into the corridor. Mrs. Rudd was at the bottom of the stairs, her hands still on the receiver, her face arranged into the expression of a woman who intends to be adequate to whatever is required of her. "I'm afraid," she said when she saw Miss Marple, "that there has been an incident." "Mr. Sohn," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Rudd looked at her with the particular attention one gives to a thing that has surprised you by speaking first. "Yes," she said, "he appears to be... The doctor is coming. I have telephoned the doctor." "And the police?" A pause. "Yes," said Mrs. Rudd, "and the police." Miss Marple descended the remaining stairs and guided Mrs. Rudd gently but with complete firmness towards the sitting-room, where she deposited her in the chair nearest the fire, and put a glass of the inn's cooking sherry into her hand, without asking whether she wanted it, because the question was irrelevant. Then she sat opposite and waited with the patience of a woman who has sat opposite a great many people in a great many difficult moments, and understood that the most useful thing one can do in the immediate aftermath of shock is simply to remain. "He was lying on the floor," said Mrs. Rudd after a moment, "between the bed and the window. I did think at first that he had perhaps fallen. People do fall when they are unwell." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but the expression on his face." She stopped. She took a careful sip of sherry. It was not the expression of someone who had simply fallen. "No," said Miss Marple, "I don't suppose it was." She asked no further questions then. There would be time for questions, and they would be better asked when Mrs. Rudd had had 20 minutes with the sherry and the fire, and when the doctor had come and gone and provided the particular cold clarity of a medical verdict. What she was doing instead in the sitting-room of the Mapleroft Inn on an October noon was thinking about the toast. The toast that had not been touched. The tea that had gone cold in its cup long before Mrs. Rudd had carried it upstairs. Which meant the tray had been prepared and delivered. She had seen Mrs. Rudd ascend at 10 o'clock precisely, and Mr. Soane had not opened the door to receive it, which meant the tray had been left in the corridor, and which meant that at 10 o'clock in the morning, or before 10 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Peter Soane had already been lying on the floor of room 7. This was the first fact. The second fact was the name beneath the ink. The third fact, which she had not yet assembled into the pattern with the others, but which she set alongside them now with the careful deliberation of a woman sorting correspondence, was the expression with which Mr. Soane had looked up at the inn upon his arrival. Not the expression of a first visit. The expression of return. Someone had been in this room before him. Someone whose name began with V, and whose name Mrs. Rudd had replaced with his. The question was whether these two things, the replaced name and the replaced body, on the floor of room 7, were connected. In Miss Marple's experience, when two unusual things occurred in proximity, they were almost never independent. The world was not, in her observation, given to coincidence at the scale that coincidence was routinely invoked to explain. Major Tukes appeared in the sitting-room doorway at 10 to 1, drawn presumably by the atmosphere of controlled crisis that the Maplecroft was quietly emitting. He took in Mrs. Rudd, the sherry, and Miss Marple's expression with the rapid assessment of a man trained to evaluate situations, and said, "Something wrong?" with the directness of someone who prefers information to inference. "I'm afraid one of the guests has been taken ill," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Major Tukes looked at Mrs. Rudd. "Soane," he said, "it was an interesting thing to say. Not which guest, not how dreadful, but the specific name, produced with the efficiency of someone who has already performed the relevant calculation." Mrs. Rudd looked at him. "What made you say Mr. Soane?" Major Tukes appeared briefly to reconsider his position. In the way of a man who has spoken before, his caution caught up with his mouth. "He didn't come to breakfast," he said. "One notices, in a small establishment, process of elimination. The rest of us were present." "Quite logical," said Miss Marple. It was logical. It was also, she thought, not quite the whole of the explanation. Dr. Merrick arrived at 1 o'clock, a compact, energetic man in his late 40s, who gave the impression of having come from somewhere important, and being required somewhere important, and treating the present moment as a necessary interruption between the two. He went upstairs with Mrs. Rudd, spent 11 minutes in room 7, and came down with the expression that medical men wear when they are deciding how much to say. And to whom? He said enough. He said not natural causes in his opinion. He said the police would need to be notified if they had not been. He said nobody should leave the premises. Then he used the telephone himself, and spoke for 4 minutes in a low voice, and left. Miss Avery had returned from the village during the doctor's visit, and was standing in the hall when he departed. She had gone quite pale. Not the pale of surprise, Miss Marple noticed, but the pale of confirmation, the colour that comes to a face when something feared has been shown to be real. "What has happened?" she asked the room. "Mr. Soane has died," said Miss Marple. Miss Avery closed her eyes for precisely 3 seconds. Then she opened them and looked directly at Miss Marple and said something that, under the circumstances, was rather extraordinary. "Then it is too late," she said. Nobody asked her what she meant. The fire made its small sounds. Outside on the lane, a motor car passed unknowing, and the horse chestnuts let fall 2 more conkers onto the flagstones, patient and indifferent as ever. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. Chapter 4. The Archaeology of Small Things. Detective Inspector Graves arrived at 2:30. He was a tall man with the particular leanness of someone who had once been heavier and had not quite adjusted to the revision, so that his suit seemed to have been cut for a previous version of himself, and his movements within it carried a faint air of apology. He had a long, careful chin and eyes that moved quickly across a room before his expression committed to anything, which Miss Marple recognized as a professional habit and a useful one. He was accompanied by a younger constable named Briggs, who had the eager attentiveness of a man at the beginning of his career, before careers have taught their particular lessons about eagerness. Mrs. Rudd received them in the hall and took them upstairs. They were in room 7 for 31 minutes, during which the 4 remaining guests sat in the sitting room, in the configuration that groups of strangers adopt when confined together by circumstance. Near enough to observe propriety, far enough to avoid intimacy. The fire had been built up by Mrs. Rudd before her ascent, and it burned with rather more enthusiasm than the mood of the room strictly warranted. Major Tukes read his old newspaper with diminishing conviction. Mr. Hadley sat with his hands on his knees in the posture Miss Marple had first observed at tea, arranged and deliberate. Miss Avery had not moved from the chair she had taken when she came in from the hall, and she had not spoken again since her extraordinary remark, which sat in the room's atmosphere like a word written in invisible ink, present and potent, and not yet developed into legibility. Miss Marple knitted. She was working on a cardigan for her great-niece, a child of 7 who had specific views on colour, and the particular shade of blue she was using required attention at the seams, which gave her a perfectly natural reason to look up at intervals and look down again. The rhythm of it unremarkable, and she had long found deeply conducive to thought. She was thinking about small things. The small things were these: Mr. Hadley's hands, which were still. Most people in a room containing recent violent death were not still. They fidgeted with cuffs, with watch straps, with the corners of newspapers. Mr. Hadley was still in the way of someone who had decided to be still, which was different from someone who simply was. Major Tukes's newspaper, which was dated the 12th of October. Today was the 14th. He had arrived on the 13th. The newspaper had therefore not been purchased in Breenham on his arrival, but brought from wherever he had been before, which meant he had carried a 2-day-old newspaper on a journey to a Surrey village, which was either the habit of a man who read slowly or the habit of a man whose attention during the journey had been occupied elsewhere. Miss Avery's coat, which she had not removed. She had returned from the village at 1:05, come inside, learned of the death, and was still wearing her coat now, at nearly 3 o'clock. As though departure remained a possibility she was not prepared to relinquish. And the room itself, room 7, from which she had heard during those 31 minutes of police occupation the particular sounds of a systematic search, drawers opened and closed, the creak of a wardrobe, the sound of a suitcase being examined. Mr. Soane had arrived with 1 overnight bag. A man who arrives with 1 overnight bag is either staying one night, or he is a man of very spare habits. He had not struck her at a dinner as a man of spare habits. He had been quite particular about the sauce, and had asked Mrs. Rudd 3 questions about the pudding before ordering it, which suggested a person who was accustomed to his preferences mattering. Such people did not generally travel light by inclination. They travelled light because they had expected to need very little, or because they had expected not to stay. Dewar Graves came downstairs at 3:15 and asked to speak with each guest individually, beginning, he said, with Mrs. Rudd, and then proceeding in whatever order was convenient. Miss Marple indicated that she was in no particular hurry. Major Tukes said the same, with the resigned dignity of a man accustomed to waiting in rooms. Mr. Hadley said nothing but inclined his head. Miss Avery said, "Yes, of course," in the voice of someone agreeing to something they have been expecting. She was called second, after Mrs. Rudd, and was gone for 19 minutes. When she returned, her face was composed in the careful way of a face that has just been composed, and the effort still faintly visible at the edges. Mr. Hadley was called third. He was gone for 24 minutes, which was longer than Miss Avery, and suggested either more to say or more that required the particular negotiation of deciding what to say. Major Tukes went fourth, 14 minutes. He came back looking slightly affronted, which in Miss Marple's experience meant he had been asked questions he felt were beneath his dignity to be asked, which usually meant they were precisely the right questions. She was called last. D.I. Graves had established himself in the dining room, at the table farthest from the door, with Constable Briggs and his notebook to one side. He gestured Miss Marple to the chair opposite, with the courteous efficiency of a man who had done this many times, and had learned that the quality of what came next depended considerably on the quality of the invitation. "Miss Marple," he said, "you arrived yesterday afternoon. On the 2:15 from Guildford," she said, "a hired motor from the station. And you knew none of the other guests previously?" "I had not met any of them before yesterday, no." He asked her several questions of the establishing variety. Her reason for visiting, her movements that morning, whether she had heard anything unusual during the night. She answered each one fully and without elaboration, which was not the same as answering completely. Then he said, "Did you form any impressions of Mr. Soane during dinner last evening?" "He seemed," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "like a man who had come to Breenham for a specific purpose, not for rest or for business in the ordinary sense. He had the manner of someone attending to something unfinished." D.I. Graves looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Unfinished," he repeated. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And I noticed this morning that the register in the hall, the entry for room 7, appeared to have been written over. The original entry beneath the current one began, I believe, with the letter V." The recalibration completed itself. "Did it?" said Defias the Graves. It was not quite a question. "I thought you would want to know," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "These small things. One never knows which ones matter until rather later. Does one?" She folded her hands in her lap and waited. And outside the dining-room window, the afternoon light was already beginning its October retreat, pulling the shadows of the horse-chestnuts long across the flagstone path, patient and unhurried, like everything else in Breenham that knew how to wait. Chapter 5. What the Village Remembered. D.I. Graves left the Maplecroft at 4 o'clock with Constable Briggs and the register. He took the register under his arm with the careful neutrality of a man removing evidence in front of witnesses who are aware it is evidence. and said to Mrs. Rudd, in the hall, that he would require everyone to remain available and that he would return in the morning. And he said this with the particular tone of a policeman who means exactly what he says, and is accustomed to people believing he means something slightly less. Mrs. Rudd stood at the door and watched the police motor car until it reached the curve of the lane and disappeared behind the horse chestnuts. And then she closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment. And Miss Marple, passing through the hall with her coat and her walking stick, observed that Mrs. Rudd's composure was intact, but that maintaining it was now costing her considerably more than it had that morning. "I thought I might take a little air before it grows dark," said Miss Marple. "The lane, and perhaps the village, if my ankle permits." "The lane is quite safe," said Mrs. Rudd automatically, "though it will be dark by 5. I shall be careful," said Miss Marple, and went out. The afternoon had settled into the cool, clear quality that October sometimes produces, between the morning mist and the evening chill, a window of pale gold light that made everything look very clean and slightly impermanent, as though the landscape were being shown to its best advantage before being put away. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, noting the crushed conkers, the tyre marks from the police vehicle still visible in the soft verge, and the light in an upper window of the inn, which was not room 7. That window was dark, but the room beside it, which she believed to be Mrs. Rudd's private quarters. She walked to the village. A Breenham in the late afternoon had the particular quality of a place that is not quite asleep and not quite awake, suspended in the amber hour, between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. The post office was still open, its lights now on, casting a yellow oblong onto the pavement. 2 women stood outside it in conversation, their voices dropping as Miss Marple approached and rising again as she passed, which told her that news of the Maplecroft had reached the village, as news in such places always does, through channels that are never quite traceable and never quite wrong. She went into the post office. It was run by a woman named Mrs. Partridge, who was perhaps 60 and had the bright, retentive eyes of someone for whom the post office was not merely a commercial enterprise, but a vocation, the serious vocation of knowing everything that passed through Breenham, literally and otherwise. She greeted Miss Marple with the warmth of a woman meeting a potential source of information, and correctly identifying that the transaction might flow in both directions. "You'll be from the Maplecroft," said Mrs. Partridge without preamble. "I arrived yesterday," said Miss Marple. "I wanted some stamps and perhaps a little conversation if you're not too busy." Mrs. Partridge was not too busy. She never was for conversation. She produced the stamps and leaned on her counter with the ease of a woman settling in. "Terrible business," she said. "The doctor's motor car. And then the police. One of my regulars walks past the inn at 12:30, and she said there were 2 motors on the lane, which there never are, not in October." "It has been rather a difficult day," Miss Marple agreed. "The Maplecrofts had difficult days before," said Mrs. Partridge, with the careful relish of someone deploying information they have been holding in reserve. "Not recent years, but before." Miss Marple arranged her stamps with gentle attention. "Before Mrs. Rudd's time." "During," said Mrs. Partridge. 7, 8 years ago. There was a guest, a Mr. Vane this was, who came for a fortnight and left after 3 days, and the leaving was not ordinary leaving. There was a doctor then too. And the police, though not for long, because it was decided in the end to be natural, or near enough to natural that natural was what was written. "Mr. Vane," said Miss Marple. "Vincent Vane," said Mrs. Partridge, with the satisfaction of a woman producing the full title of a thing. "He was a London man. Not young, 60 perhaps, or near it. He'd stayed at the Maplecroft once or twice before, over the years. Knew the village a little." "Did he have connections here?" Mrs. Partridge tilted her head with the precision of someone accessing a specific memory. "He knew the Hadley family," she said. "There was a Hadley in Breenham then. Not the same one that's there now, the brother of someone. It was all rather, people talked at the time, but nothing came of it. And after a while people stopped talking, the way they do." "The way they do," said Miss Marple softly. "Room 7, she said then, as though thinking aloud. "Mrs. Partridge looked at her. "He was in room 7, she said. "Yes, I don't know how you knew that, but yes." Miss Marple smiled the mild smile that had deceived a considerable number of people over the years into believing she had arrived at information by accident. "And the inn has been quite without incident since then?" "Quite," said Mrs. Partridge, "until now." Miss Marple bought her stamps and thanked Mrs. Partridge, and walked back along the lane in the last of the October light, which had gone from gold to bronze, to a thin grey that was almost not light at all. She walked carefully, because the conkers were treacherous underfoot in the dimness. She was thinking about Vincent Vane, a man who had died in room 7 or 8 years ago, of causes natural enough to be recorded as such, but unusual enough to be remembered by a postmistress across nearly a decade. A man who had known the Hadley family. A man whose name, she was now quite certain, had been the original entry on the 14th line of the Maplecroft register, written over in blue ink with the name of a second man who had arrived in Breenham with the expression of return, and had been found dead on the floor of the same room before his breakfast had grown cold. The horse chestnuts were invisible now against the darkening sky, but she heard one fall, a clean, sharp sound on the flagstones ahead, and she stopped and found it with her stick and moved it carefully to the verge. 2 men, 1 room, 7 years apart. She went inside, and the inn closed around her, warm and old and very quiet, to Chapter 6, The Uses of Dinner. Mrs. Rudd served dinner at 7 as promised, because Mrs. Rudd was the kind of woman who kept her promises regardless of what the day had contained. And there was in this something both admirable and slightly unnerving, the sense that the ordinary machinery of the inn would continue to turn, even if the circumstances feeding into it became extraordinary. The way a clock keeps time through a storm because the storm is irrelevant to the mechanism. The dining room held all 4 guests. This was itself a small fact worth noting. Miss Marple had half expected one or more of them to request a tray in their room, which would have been understandable, and which would also have told her something. But they were all present. Major Tukes already seated when she arrived, Mr., and Hadley taking the chair he had occupied at breakfast with the same deliberate positioning. Miss Avery arriving last and sitting with her back to the wall, which was either habitual or intentional, and Miss Marple could not yet determine which. The soup was a good vegetable, clear and honest, and for a few minutes it provided the table. They had been placed, by Mrs. Rudd's arrangement or by gravity, at a single large table rather than their separate breakfast tables, with the useful social function of something to do that was not talking. It was Major Tukes who broke it. Graves seemed a competent man, he said, in the tone of someone issuing a verdict they consider generous. Methodical. asked the right questions, more or less." "More or less," said Mr. Hadley, without looking up from his soup. "He asked me," said Major Tukes, "whether I had known Soane previously, which I had not. I told him so. He asked us all that, I imagine," said Miss Avery. "I imagine he did." Major Tukes set down his spoon. "The question is whether everyone answered it the same way." A silence assembled itself around the table. It had the slightly pressurized quality of a silence that has been produced by a statement intended to produce it. Miss Marple, who had been quietly eating her soup and attending to everything, said, "Do you have reason to think someone might have known him previously, Major Tukes?" Major Tukes looked at her with the expression he had been deploying since her arrival, the expression of a man recalibrating his estimate of something he had initially underestimated. "I have reason to think," he said carefully, "that Soane didn't come to Breenham for the walking." "The walking is very poor at this time of year," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "The lanes are quite wet by afternoon." Mr. Hadley put down his spoon. He did it without emphasis, the way a person removes a thing they no longer need. "I'll say plainly," he said, "since we are apparently doing this, I did not know Soane. I knew of him, which is a different thing. He was connected to a property matter that also involved someone I represent professionally. I am a solicitor. I came to Breenham because the matter required my presence here, and not because of any prior arrangement with Soane." The room received this. "A property matter," said Miss Avery, and her voice had a quality Miss Marple had not heard in it before, not quite bitterness, but the register adjacent to it. "Yes," said Mr. Hadley, "in Breenham specifically, in the surrounding area." He picked up his spoon again, which meant he considered the subject addressed. Miss Avery appeared to consider whether to accept this. She did not quite. "I knew Peter Soane," she said, "since we are being plain. I knew him slightly, through a mutual acquaintance. I came to Breenham because I had heard he would be here, and I wanted to speak with him about a matter that was personal." "Personal?" repeated Major Tukes, in the tone of a man for whom the word raises rather than settles questions. "Personal?" said Miss Avery, with a finality that drew a line under it. Mrs. Rudd appeared with the fish course, which was a sole done simply and well, and the conversation paused while she moved around the table, and Miss Marple watched Mrs. Rudd's face during this service, the controlled attention, the eyes that did not meet any guest's eyes, but moved instead to the space slightly above each person. The way one looks when listening to something that cannot be looked at directly. When Mrs. Rudd left, Miss Marple said quite gently, "I wonder whether any of you knew a Mr. Vincent Vane?" It was a stone dropped into a pool, and she watched the surface. Mr. Hadley's hands, which had been lifting his fork, stopped. Not for long, a fraction of a second, the smallest measurable pause, but the fork had been on its way up, and it completed the journey fractionally late, as though the signal had taken slightly longer than normal to travel from decision to action. Major Tukes looked up from his plate. His expression was the controlled blankness of a man producing controlled blankness, which is always more visible than genuine blankness. Miss Avery looked directly at Miss Marple. Of the three, her reaction was the most interesting because it was the least concealed. Something moved across her face that was not surprise. It was, Miss Marple thought, something closer to recognition. Not of the name itself, perhaps, but of the significance of its being spoken aloud, here, at this table, on this evening. "I don't believe I know that name," said Major Tukes. "No," said Mr. Hadley. Miss Avery said nothing at all, which was the loudest response of the three. The meal continued. The sole was followed by a roast, and then a pudding that was better than the circumstances deserved, and the conversation returned to the surface topics that people use to paper over the rooms they do not wish to open. The weather, the unreliability of rural transport, a brief exchange between Major Tukes and Mr. Hadley about a cricket matter that both men prosecuted with the enthusiasm of people who are not thinking about cricket at all. Miss Marple ate her pudding and said very little. She was thinking about the fork that had stopped for the fraction of a second in which a name crosses a room and finds its target, before continuing its ordinary journey to Mr. Clifford Hadley's mouth, a solicitor who knew of Soane, but not Soane, who had come for a property matter, who had a professional connection to someone connected to Soane, who had, 7 or 8 years ago, according to Mrs. Partridge, was a familial connection of some kind to Breenham, where a man named Vincent Vane had died in room 7 and been written into the natural record and largely forgotten. Largely, but not entirely. The fork had told her that. She thanked Mrs. Rudd for an excellent dinner and went upstairs. And the inn settled around its remaining guests, and room 7 remained dark. And outside on the lane, the wind had come up and was moving through the horse-chestnuts, with a sound like something trying to say something in a language just slightly beyond comprehension. Chapter 7. The Letter Behind the Glass. Miss Marple did not sleep well. This was not the mattress which she had by now accommodated, nor the wind which had settled by midnight into a steady, unremarkable persistence rather than the theatrical gusting of its earlier hours. It was the particular wakefulness that comes not from discomfort, but from the proximity of an incomplete thing, the feeling of a puzzle in which all of the pieces are present but 2 or 3 remain face down, and the mind, unwilling to abandon the table, keeps returning in the dark to turn them over. She lay still and thought carefully. Vincent Vane had died in room 7 or 8 years ago. His death had been recorded as natural, or near enough natural. He had known the Hadley family. Mr. Clifford Hadley, solicitor, had come to Breenham on a property matter, and had paused for the fraction of a second when Vincent Vane's name was spoken at dinner. Peter Soane had arrived at the Mapleroft with the expression of return, had been assigned room 7, and had been found dead on its floor before 10 o'clock in the morning, ate his breakfast untouched. Mrs. Rudd had written Soane's name over Vane's in the register. Miss Avery had come to speak with Soane about something personal, and had said, upon learning of his death, that it was too late. Major Tukes had produced controlled blankness at the name Vane, and had known, without being told, that it was Soane who had died. These were the face-up pieces. The face-down pieces were what connected Vane and Soane beyond the room, what the property matter was that had brought Hadley to Breenham, what Miss Avery had needed to say to Soane that could no longer be said, and why Mrs. Rudd had replaced one dead man's name with another living man's, rather than simply assigning the living man a different room. That last question interested her most. There were, she thought, 2 possible explanations for the overwriting, and the first was administrative. Room 7 had been assigned to another guest who had cancelled, and Soane had been given it by default, and Mrs. Rudd had tidied the register with more haste than care. This was plausible. It was also, she thought, too convenient, which in her experience was the characteristic most commonly shared by explanations that were not quite true. The second explanation was that the overwriting had been deliberate, that Mrs. Rudd had specifically not wanted a record of the original guest's name alongside the room and the date, for reasons that connected the original guest to something she wished to keep below the surface. At 2:30 she gave up on sleep, put on her dressing gown and her slippers, took her torch, and went quietly into the corridor. And the inn at night had a different character from the inn by day. The familiar creaks and settlings of old timber that were background noise in daylight became, in the silence, distinct and individual, each one presenting itself for consideration before the next. Miss Marple moved along the corridor with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never regarded darkness as a reason for timidity, only for additional care. She was not going to room 7. The police had sealed room 7 with the length of tape that Constable Briggs had stretched across the door before their departure, and she had no intention of disturbing it. She was going instead to the writing desk in the sitting room downstairs, where she had observed on her first evening something that she had noted and set aside, and was now ready to examine more closely. And the sitting room was cold, the fire long dead. She crossed to the writing desk and opened the shallow drawer above the writing surface, which contained the stationery she had noted, slightly damp, faintly mottled, and beneath the stationery, a collection of the small miscellaneous items that accumulate in the drawers of in-writing desks over the years. A stub of sealing wax, 2 foreign coins, a broken pen nib, and a folded piece of paper that had been pushed to the very back of the drawer and which, unlike the stationery above it, was not mottled and was not damp because it had been protected by the stationery above it. She unfolded it. It was a letter. Or rather, it was the lower portion of a letter, the upper section having been torn away, so that it began mid-sentence, without salutation or date, and the handwriting was small and compressed, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to saying a great deal in limited space. Cannot continue to remain silent regarding the arrangement, which was entered into under conditions that were not fully disclosed to all parties. V was aware of the encumbrance on the property at the time of the agreement. I have reason to believe this awareness was not incidental. If you intend to proceed with the transfer, you must understand that I will not. The letter ended there. The rest had been torn with the upper section. Miss Marple read it twice, then once more, and folded it along its original creases and placed it in the pocket of her dressing gown. She stood for a moment in the cold sitting room, her torch making a small circle of light on the writing desk, and outside the wind had dropped entirely now, and the lane was absolutely still. And in the stillness she heard something that she had not expected to hear at 2:30 in the morning at the Mapleroft Inn. Footsteps on the stairs, not descending, ascending. She moved to the sitting room doorway and listened. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and moved along the upper corridor, and then stopped. She counted the doors in her mind: her room, Major Tuke's, Miss Avery, Mr. Hadley, the bathroom, Mrs. Rudd's quarters, and room 7. The footsteps had stopped where room 7 was. She heard very clearly in the complete silence of the inn the soft sound of tape being peeled from a door frame. Then a door opening. Then, after perhaps 40 seconds, a door closing. Then the footsteps returning, descending, and crossing the ground floor, toward the back of the building, towards the kitchen, where Mrs. Rudd's private entrance was. Miss Marple stood in the dark sitting room for a long moment, her hand on the folded letter in her pocket, her thoughts moving with the careful precision of someone who has just watched a face-down piece turn itself over voluntarily, which is always more interesting than turning it yourself. She went back upstairs. She did not sleep, but the wakefulness had changed in quality. It was no longer the frustration of incompletion, but the particular alert stillness of someone who has seen the shape of the thing, not yet its details, but its shape, and is waiting with considerably more patience now for the details to arrange themselves accordingly. And Chapter 8. The Weight of Old Arrangements. De Graves returned at 9 o'clock. He came alone this time, without Constable Briggs, which Miss Marple noted as a detail of some significance. A man who brings his notebook to a second visit is gathering. A man who leaves it behind is testing. He arrived in a plain motor car, parked it tidily on the verge, and came up the flagstone path with the particular purposefulness of someone who has spent the intervening hours reading and is now ready to ask the questions that the reading has produced. Mrs. Rudd admitted him with the composure she had been maintaining since yesterday noon, which was holding, but which had, Miss Marple observed from the sitting-room doorway, developed a very faint quality of strain around the eyes, not the strain of grief, but the strain of sustained effort, at the look of a person carrying something heavy over a long distance and beginning to feel the distance. Graves went directly to the dining room, and Mrs. Rudd followed him, and the door closed. The remaining guests had assembled in the sitting room in the loose, unplanned way of people who have discovered that proximity to others is preferable, on a morning of this kind, to solitude. The fire had been built up early. The day outside was the flat, featureless grey of October at its least charitable, offering neither rain nor light, but a kind of determined neutrality that made the sitting-room feel more enclosed than usual. Major Tukes was doing something with his watch, winding it, checking it, winding it again, with the repetitive abstraction of a man whose hands require occupation while his mind is elsewhere. Mr. E. Hadley was writing in a small notebook, which he closed when he became aware of Miss Marple's attention, and placed in his inside pocket with a naturalness that was slightly too natural, in the way of a gesture that has been practised into smoothness. Miss Avery was at the window. She had been there when Miss Marple came downstairs, and had not moved from it, watching the lane with the concentrated stillness of someone expecting an arrival, or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, expecting a departure and waiting to confirm it. Miss Marple took her chair and her knitting and said pleasantly to the room, "I imagine Inspector Graves has had a rather busy night." "Police generally do," said Major Tukes, without looking up from his watch. "I wonder," said Miss Marple, continuing with the seam of the cardigan, "whether anyone else had a disturbed night. The wind was quite insistent until about midnight, I thought." "I slept adequately," said Mr. Hadley. "I didn't sleep at all," said Miss Avery from the window, "and there was no performance in it. It was simply a fact she was offering. The way one offers a fact when concealing it would require more energy than releasing it." "No," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "I find that when one has something important left unsaid, sleep becomes rather difficult." Miss Avery turned from the window. She looked at Miss Marple with the expression that Miss Marple had now seen twice, the expression of someone recalibrating what they are dealing with. "You are very perceptive for someone here on recuperation," she said. The tone was not unkind. It was, in fact, almost grateful, the tone of someone who has been carrying a thing alone, and finds unexpectedly that someone else has seen its weight. "I am old," said Miss Marple simply, "and I have known a great many people. Occasionally the two things are useful." Major Tukes set down his watch with a small, decisive sound. "I will say," he said, to no particular point in the room, "that I came to Breenham because of Vincent Vane." The fire made its sounds. Outside, nothing moved on the lane. "I was his executor," said Major Tukes into the silence. "His estate executor, appointed 8 years ago when he was alive and revoked, or allegedly revoked, 6 months after his death, in circumstances that I considered at the time to be highly irregular, and have considered highly irregular ever since." He said this with the flat precision of a man reading from a document he has memorized. There was a property in this area, a farmhouse and its land, approximately 40 acres, registered in Vane's name for purposes of an arrangement whose terms I was never made fully privy to, despite my appointment. After his death, the property transferred to a holding company whose beneficial ownership has never been publicly established. I came here because I received, 3 weeks ago, an anonymous letter indicating that the transfer was about to be completed in some final sense, and that Peter Soane was involved. The room absorbed this. "An anonymous letter," said Mr. Hadley carefully. Yes. Saying Soane was involved. Saying Soane had documents." Major Tukes looked at Mr. Hadley with the steady look of a man who has decided to be direct, and is watching to see what directness dislodges. "Documents pertaining to the original arrangement, which Vane had apparently entrusted to him, which is why, I imagine, Soane came here." Miss Avery had left the window and sat down, and her face had the particular expression of someone hearing a version of a story they know from a different angle. "Vincent Vane was my mother's brother," she said. "My uncle. I came because Peter Soane wrote to me, 4 weeks ago, saying he had something belonging to our family that he wished to return. He did not say what it was. He said only to come to Breenham in October, and he would explain." The silence had a different quality now, not the pressurized silence of concealment, but the quieter silence of things arranging themselves into their true positions after long displacement. Miss Marple set down her knitting. From her cardigan pocket she had transferred it before coming downstairs. She removed the folded letter and placed it on the side table, with the careful deliberateness of someone contributing a piece to a puzzle that belongs to everyone present. "I found this last night," she said, "in the writing-desk drawer. I believe it may have been written by Mr. Vane. I believe the property to which it refers is the farmhouse Major Tukes has described. And I believe," she added gently, "that Mr. I. Hadley knows considerably more about the holding company than he has so far indicated." Mr. Hadley looked at the folded letter on the table. His face was very still. His hands were very still. The notebook was in his pocket, and his hands rested on his knees. And the stillness was complete. And in its completeness it was, finally, not the stillness of control, but the stillness of a man who has run out of the particular energy that stillness requires. "I should," he said after a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment, "like to speak to Inspector Graves." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I thought you might." She picked up her knitting, and the fire settled. And outside the grey October morning continued its flat indifferent progress across Breenham, and the horse-chestnuts stood in their patient row along the lane. And somewhere inside the Mapleroft Inn, a door opened, and Mr. Clifford Hadley's footsteps crossed the hall toward the dining-room, where D.I. Graves was waiting, and the weight of 8 years of old arrangement moved with him, heavy and long-carried, and at last, perhaps, nearly set down. Chapter 9. The Farmhouse at the Edge of the Map. Mr. Hadley was in with D.I. Graves for 47 minutes. Miss Marple knew this because she counted, not obsessively, but with the quiet precision she applied to all things that had a duration worth measuring. The sitting room during those 47 minutes had the suspended quality of a waiting room in which everyone is aware that what is happening in the adjacent space will determine what happens next in their own, but no one can yet calculate the shape of it. Major Tukes had stopped winding his watch. He sat with it closed in his palm, a still, heavy object, and stared at the middle distance with the expression of a man reassembling a narrative he has held for 8 years, into the new configuration that this morning's disclosures required. Miss Avery had not returned to the window. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the fire, and Miss Marple observed that she was not watching the fire so much as using it as a surface on which to project an interior landscape that was considerably more complicated than anything the flames were doing. Miss Marple knitted and thought about the farmhouse. 40 acres and a farmhouse, registered in Vincent Vane's name as a part of an arrangement whose terms had been concealed from his own executor, transferred after his death to a holding company of unestablished ownership, was about to be, in Major Tukes's word, completed in some final sense that had been sufficient motivation to bring 3 people to Breenham in October, and sufficient motivation, she was increasingly certain, for one person to ensure that Peter Soane did not leave it alive. The question of the holding company's ownership was, she thought, the question behind all the other questions. It was the locked room inside the locked room. Mr. Hadley, as a solicitor, had known about it, had come ostensibly for a property matter, had made a telephone call on his first morning in which the word confirmed had appeared, and then the word already spoken with relief. Confirmed what? Already what? Already dead, she thought. He had been told by whoever was on the other end of that telephone that Soane was already dead, and which meant whoever he had called had known of Soane's death before the police had been officially notified, which created a very narrow set of possibilities regarding who had placed the call that Mr. Hadley had received. She set this aside for the moment and returned to the farmhouse. When Hadley emerged at 10:47, he looked like a man who has put something down after carrying it for a long time, lighter, but with the particular unsteadiness of someone whose posture has been shaped by a weight now absent. He stood in the sitting-room doorway and looked at the assembled company with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now inhabiting its consequences. "Graves wants to speak to each of you again," he said, "separately." He paused. "I have told him everything I know about the Vane estate and the property arrangement. I have told him the name of the holding company and its beneficial owner." He stopped. He looked at Miss Avery. "I am sorry," he said with a simplicity that suggested the apology was genuine, and that its genuineness did not make it adequate. Miss Avery looked at him for a long moment. "Did you know," she said, "that my uncle's death was not natural?" "I suspected," said Hadley. "I did not know. There is a distinction I have been making for 8 years, that I am no longer certain I am entitled to make." He sat down, and the room received him. And nobody said anything further because everything that could usefully be said in the sitting-room had been said, and what remained required the dining-room and D.I. Graves. Miss Marple was called second, after Major Tukes. Graves looked, she thought, like a man who has received a considerable quantity of information in a short time, and is in the process of organizing it into its correct architecture. He had his notebook open now, and a map, which he had spread on the dining table, and waited at the corners with a salt cellar and 3 unused teaspoons. The map was of the Breenham area, and on it, in pencil, a property had been circled approximately 2 miles east of the village, at the end of a track that left the main lane just past the point where the horse chestnuts ended. "You'll know this property," said Graves, which was not quite a question. "I know of it now," said Miss Marple. "I did not when I arrived." He looked at her with the expression he had been developing since her first interview, the expression of a man who has revised his estimate of a witness upwards several times and is now simply accepting the revised estimate without further resistance. "Hadley tells me the holding company that received the Vane estate transfer is registered to a nominee, but the beneficial ownership traces to a family trust. The trust was established in 1951. The trustee of record is a Mrs. Edith Rudd." The name settled into the room with the quiet finality of something that has been approaching for some time. "Yes," said Miss Marple. Graves looked at her carefully. "You are not surprised." "I'm not surprised that it is Mrs. Rudd," said Miss Marple. "I am slightly surprised that the trust was established in 1951, which would have been before she acquired the inn. It suggests the arrangement between her and Mr. Vane was considerably older than the inn itself, and that the inn may have been, in some sense, part of its infrastructure." Graves wrote something. "You found the letter last night?" "Yes." "In the writing desk?" "Yes. It had been there some time, I think, protected by the stationery above it from the damp. I believe Mr. Vane left it there, possibly deliberately, as a kind of insurance. People who enter arrangements of uncertain legality sometimes leave such things in places where they cannot be directly associated with the leaving." "And the footsteps you heard at 2:30? "I believe Mrs. Rudd went to room 7 to retrieve something Soane had brought with him, and the documents Major Tukes mentioned. The documents Vane had entrusted to Soane. I believe she did not find them, or she would not have admitted Graves so readily this morning. A person who has found what they were looking for behaves differently from a person who has not." Graves looked at the map. He looked at the circled farmhouse. "The documents," he said, "were not in room 7. Constable Briggs went through it thoroughly yesterday afternoon." "No," said Miss Marple. "I didn't think they would be." "Where then?" Miss Marple considered the overnight bag. The man of specific preferences, who had not packed lightly by inclination, who had arrived with one small bag because he had not brought the documents with him to the inn. "The farmhouse," she said. "I believe Mr. Soane visited it before coming to the Maplecroft. I believe he left the documents there, in the property that was originally Vane's, which would have been both meaningful and prudent. He came to the inn with the knowledge of their location rather than the documents themselves, which made him dangerous to someone, but not in the way that could be resolved simply by taking his bag." She paused. "It made him dangerous in a way that could only be resolved," she said quietly, "by ensuring he could not speak." Graves closed his notebook. Outside, the grey morning had not improved. The lane was empty and the horse chestnuts stood in their row, and the Maplecroft sat at the end of its path, warm and old and containing, somewhere in its settled atmosphere, the particular silence of a thing that has been hidden for a very long time, and has finally, in the most irreversible of ways, to run out of room to hide. Chapter 10. The Thing That Was Always There. Graves left for the farmhouse at 11:30. He went with 2 uniformed officers in a second motor car that had arrived quietly on the lane while Miss Marple was still in the dining room, and which she had noted through the window with the satisfaction of someone watching a prediction fulfill itself. He said nothing to the assembled guests about where he was going, which was professionally correct and also unnecessary, because the map on the dining table had been visible to Miss Marple, and she was quite certain that the dining room door had not been entirely closed during the latter portion of her interview with Graves. She was quite certain, in fact, that it had been open by precisely the width required for someone standing in the hall to hear without being seen. She returned to the sitting room. Mrs. Rudd was absent from the inn's public rooms for the entire morning. She could be heard intermittently in the kitchen, which was producing the ordinary sounds of a midday meal being prepared, the reliable percussion of pots, and the low industry of someone who understands that feeding people is a form of management as much as it is a form of care. Miss Marple had observed this before in women of Mrs. Rudd's type. The retreat into function when function is the only remaining form of control available. As long as there was a meal to prepare, there was a role to occupy. The role was a kind of shelter. It would not, Miss Marple thought, shelter her much longer. At noon, Miss Avery came to sit beside her, and this was deliberate. She chose the chair closest to Miss Marple's, with the intentionality of someone who has decided to say something and has selected the moment and the proximity with care. She sat for a minute without speaking, watching the fire, and Miss Marple gave her the minute without filling it, because some things require a short runway before they will leave the ground. "My uncle was not a straightforward man," said Miss Avery. "I want you to understand that. I loved him, but he was not straightforward. He made arrangements that suited himself and dressed them as arrangements that suited everyone, and the people who trusted him generally found, at some point, that the trust had been extended slightly further than it could bear." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "there are such people, and they are not always unlovable." "He was not unlovable." She paused. "He and Edith Rudd had known each other for a very long time, before the inn, before the trust. I don't know the full extent of it. I was a child when most of it was arranged, and by the time I was old enough to understand, the arrangement was complete, and everyone had assumed their positions within it." "What do you know of the farmhouse?" said Miss Marple. "I know it belonged originally to my grandmother's family. I know my uncle acquired it through means that were never fully explained to us. I know that after he died, our family had no access to it and no formal claim to it, which my mother accepted because she was not a woman who fought for things, and which I did not accept, but could not contest without the documentation that established the original arrangement." She turned to look at Miss Marple directly. "Which is what Peter Soane had." "Which is what Peter Soane had," Miss Marple agreed. "He was my uncle's solicitor's clerk, years ago. He was there when some of the papers were drawn up. He had copies of certain documents that he kept, he said in his letter, against the day when they might be needed. He was not a good man exactly. He was a careful one. He kept things because keeping things had value, and he waited because waiting for the right moment had value. And when the property was about to change hands finally and completely, he decided the moment had arrived." "And came to Breenham to negotiate," said Miss Marple. "I believe so. With me, he is the family's representative. Perhaps with others." She looked at the fire. He did not anticipate that Mrs. Rudd would know he was coming. "No," said Miss Marple, "though someone told her." Miss Avery was quiet for a moment. "Hadley," she said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a conclusion arrived at, and not yet fully felt. "I think Mr. Hadley informed his client that Soane intended to produce the documents," said Miss Marple carefully. "I think his client is Mrs. Rudd, or is connected sufficiently closely to Mrs. Rudd that the information reached her." I think Mr. Hadley told himself that informing his client was his professional obligation, and that what his client did with the information was not his responsibility. And I think he has spent the last 36 hours discovering that this distinction is, while legally defensible, is not particularly habitable. The fire settled. A log shifted and sent up a brief bright flag of flame, and then subsided. Mr. Soane was not a good man, said Miss Avery again, but he did not deserve what was done to him. No, said Miss Marple. People very rarely deserve what is done to them, and the question of whether they deserve it is in any case not the relevant one. Major Tukes appeared in the doorway at 12:30, with the expression of a man who has heard something. "There's a motor on the lane," he said, "coming from the east." They listened. The motor car grew and reached the inn and stopped, and there were voices outside, Graves's voice among them, and then the sound of the front door and footsteps crossing the hall, and Mrs. Rudd's footsteps from the kitchen, and a conversation beginning in the low, serious register of conversations that will not remain private for long. Miss Marple did not move from her chair. She had in her knitting bag the blue cardigan for her great niece, which was very nearly finished. Only the second sleeve remained, and she drew it out and found her place and continued, because the second sleeve required the same attention as the first had. And there was no good reason to stop simply because other things were occurring around it. The voices in the hall continued. Outside, the horse-chestnuts stood in their row along the lane, entirely indifferent, dropping their conkers with the same steady patience they had maintained throughout, before any of this had arrived, and now, and presumably long after, it had resolved itself into whatever resolution it was going to find. Miss Marple knitted. The second sleeve grew, stitch by careful stitch, and the voices in the hall reached their conclusion. And somewhere in the Mapleroft Inn, a thing that had been concealed for 8 years came finally into the light, blinking and diminished, as concealed things always are when the concealment ends, always smaller than the space they occupied in darkness, always less than the damage their hiding had required. Chapter 11. The Shape of What Remained. Di Graves arrested Mrs. Edith Rudd at 1:12. If Miss Marple knew the precise time, because the clock on the sitting-room mantelpiece had just completed its single chime for the quarter hour, when she heard the particular quality of silence that follows the formal words. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something concluded. The way a piece of music has a silence that is different from the silence before it began. She heard Mrs. Rudd's voice once, briefly, saying something she could not distinguish. And then the front door, and the motor car on the lane. And then the Mapleroft Inn contained 3 guests and no proprietor. And a quiet that was entirely its own. Major Tukes came into the sitting-room and stood by the mantelpiece and said nothing for a full minute, which was the most eloquent thing Miss Marple had observed him do since his arrival. And then he said, "She poisoned them both." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "Vane and Soane. Yes, 8 years apart, and by different means, I suspect, which is why the first was recorded as natural and the second was not. She had more time to be careful with the first. With Mr. Soane, she had only 1 night. Major Tukes looked at the fire. "I spent 8 years believing Vane's death was irregular, without being able to prove it, without even being able to say it plainly to anyone who might act on it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is a particular kind of weight." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know it was her? From the beginning, I mean. Not the evidence, the knowing." Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I did not know from the beginning," she said. I suspected from quite early that the inn was the centre of it, rather than the guests. When you have several people arriving independently at the same location, each with their own connection to the same concealed matter, the location itself becomes a suspect. Mrs. Rudd had managed this place for 11 years. She had managed it through Vincent Vane's death and the property transfer and the subsequent silence. She had managed 4 guests who each represented, in different ways, a threat to arrangements she had built her security upon. She paused, and she had replaced his name in the register, which was not the act of an innocent woman. An innocent woman would have simply given Mr. Soane a different room. She gave him that room deliberately, said Miss Avery from the doorway. She had been standing there for some time, as Miss Marple thought, though she had made no sound. Didn't she? She put him in room 7 because she had already decided. I think so, yes. The room was familiar to her. She knew its dimensions and its habits. She knew that the door did not latch fully unless the key was turned, which meant access was simpler. She knew the position of the window and the angle of the morning light. She had been in that room a great many times over 11 years, and she knew it the way one knows a place where something significant has been done before. Miss Avery came fully into the room and sat down. She looked, Miss Marple thought, like someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long distance, and has set it down, but has not yet adjusted to the absence of its weight, so that her posture still bore the shape of carrying. The documents were at the farmhouse, she said. Yes, Graves found them. He did. In the farmhouse, as I suspected. Soane had placed them there before coming to the inn. It was, I think, his way of ensuring his own safety. A man who carries the documents himself is a man whose documents can be taken. A man who merely knows where they are is a man who must be kept alive to disclose their location. She paused. Unfortunately, Mrs. Rudd did not reason in that direction. She assumed the documents were with him, which is why she went to room 7 in the night to look for them after he was dead. When she did not find them, the situation became considerably more difficult for her. The farmhouse, said Miss Avery. It will come back to the family now. I believe that will be a matter for the courts, said Miss Marple. But the documentation Soane preserved establishes the original arrangement clearly enough. Major Tukes will be able to pursue it properly. Major Tukes straightened beside the mantelpiece with the bearing of a man who has been given back a purpose he had largely relinquished. I will, he said with a simplicity that contained rather a lot. Mr. Hadley came downstairs at 2 o'clock with his overnight bag and his carefully arranged face, and stood in the hall. He had already spoken to Graves at length, and had been told he was free to leave Breenham, which did not appear to have produced the relief one might expect. He stood in the doorway of the sitting-room, and looked at the 3 people in it, and said, I am sorry, for whatever that is worth at this point. Nobody told him what it was worth. It seemed kinder on the whole, and not to perform the calculation aloud. He left, and his motor car started on the lane and diminished toward the main road, and was gone, and the sitting-room settled back into its quiet. At 3 o'clock, a woman arrived from the village, sent by someone, Mrs. Partridge, Miss Marple suspected, whose organizational instincts were not confined to postage, to make tea and see to the guests, and she did so with the comfortable efficiency of a person performing a clear task, which was in itself a considerable relief after 2 days of tasks that had been anything but clear. Miss Marple drank her tea and finished the second sleeve of the cardigan. She held it up and examined it in the flat October light from the window, and found it satisfactory. The seams were even. The colour was precisely the shade her great-niece had requested, and it would, as she thought, fit reasonably well for at least 2 winters before the child grew beyond it. Miss Avery watched her. "You came here to recuperate," she said, with a quality in her voice that was not quite irony and not quite wonder, but something companionable between the two. "I did," said Miss Marple. "My nephew will be very pleased to hear that I rested. Will you tell him what happened?" "I will tell him that Breenham was interesting," said Miss Marple, "and that the cardigan is finished, and that I feel considerably better for the change of air." She folded the cardigan along its seams and placed it in her knitting bag with the careful satisfaction of a completed thing, and outside the horse-chestnuts stood in their patient row, and the lane was quiet, and the Mapleroft Inn held its silence around its remaining guests with the solidity of old timber and old stone, which had stood through a great deal, and would, she thought, stand through a great deal more. She would write to Raymond in the morning and ask him to arrange the motor car. There was nothing further to do in Breenham, and St. Mary Mead, with its familiar complications and its comfortable certainties, was waiting for her at the end of the road with the patient reliability of a place that knows it will be returned to, which is perhaps the most reassuring quality any place can have. She picked up her teacup and finished her tea, and the afternoon moved on, and the case of the Mapleroft Inn settled into the past tense with the quiet finality of all concluded things, leaving behind it only the questions it had answered, and the small persistent silence where the unanswered ones had been.